Hi everyone, good morning. Just waiting for the few more people to join us. Thank you everyone for joining us already. I can just see the attendees coming in, which is nice. I will say, just while we're waiting, the way that this meeting's set up is it's mostly a one-way webinar, but we do have a kind of questions and answers section. So if you want to write anything or kind of capture any comments in QA, that'd be good. Just going to wait for a few more people to join in, and then we'll get started properly in a minute. Okay, well, it's 1 minute past, so I think it's time to start the webinar. We've got a good number of people online already, which is good to see. And I think some people have already started making comments in the questions and answers. That's great. So first of all, thank you everyone very much for joining us on a Friday morning. Don't know about where you are, but it's looking particularly cloudy here, so probably better to be inside than outside at the moment. So the topic today, Sarah, if you could just go on to the next slide, is we're going to be talking about navigating the ethical use of autonomous weapon systems. So it's a topic that I hope you agree is particularly of interest to the world and us at the moment. As I was saying before, this webinar is set up so that it's mostly one way, so it'll be us talking, but I do really want to encourage everyone to use the Q&A function that we've got going. So if you have any comments or questions going throughout, then please do raise it on the Q&A, and we'll either look to address those as we go through, or at the end, we'll have a bit more of a kind of answering session or discussion session. That's all right. So before I get started, I'd like to introduce myself. So I'm Jake Rigby. I'm the Research and Development Lead here at BMT. And that means that I portfolio manage all of our internal research and development work and look after academic engagement and horizon scanning activities. Also in the call today, we have got Sarah Buffum, who only recently joined BMT, but has already gained an impressive reputation for her knowledge in this area of ethics around AI. She's a consultant in the business and recently completed her master's degree in international security at the University of Bath. And as part of this degree, she explored the topic of ethics around warfare in her MA dissertation, which was entitled, "Has Warfare Left the Human Space?" So looking at the increased depersonalization of the use of force in military affairs and the impact of autonomous weapon systems. So yeah, definitely the perfect person to be giving the main part of the presentation will come from Sarah. And then finally, we've got John Hodnott. So he's a principal consultant in our asset performance business line, specializing in safety and risk management, and specifically recently looking into a lot of the aspects around this area in autonomous systems. The only thing, unfortunately, John is sick today, so he's not able to join this call. But I've left him on the kind of speakers because he's been a big part of the work that we've done and contributes significantly to the report that we've written. So I'll try and fill in his place as much as I can today, but we'll try our best. Next slide, please, Sarah. So the agenda for today, we'll start off with a quick introduction to BMT and a bit of a forward from myself before we go into the main presentation topic, which will be given by Sarah. And this main presentation will start by describing the different levels of control and autonomy, giving some examples around them. We'll look at the international debate. So where do different countries stand on this debate? What side of the fence are they on? And what are other countries doing, as well as the UK? And then we'll look at the academic argument as well, trying to understand how or if technology can act ethically in this area. Finally, we'll look at some future scenarios that we've proposed as part of our horizon scanning work and make some recommendations on how we as a community can navigate through this challenging topic. And then at the end, we'll be kind of capturing any questions I was saying on the Q&A. So if you have any questions, make sure you're using them. And we'll look to finish off with a bit of a discussion and some closing remarks. So introduction to BMT, hopefully many of you will know who we are, but if you don't, I'll just give a very quick summary. It's always really hard to quickly summarize what BMT does because it's quite a broad range of capabilities. But if I had to do it in one line, I'd probably say it's engineering, management, and technology services consulting. So management consulting, engineering consulting. We've got a map here which shows our kind of global presence, and it's to show that all of the different blue icons are either an office or representing a customer that we've worked with around the world. So around the world globally, we've got about 2,000 employees. So it's really nice to have that global approach. And then as part of this, we've got the different aspects of the business, including the built environment, ports and infrastructure. We also do some work in oil and gas, and more specifically around some of the environmental work that we do, including looking at flood damage, defences, and other aspects. The part of the business that we're reflecting here today is Bmt Defence and Security. So it's probably the main part that you may have come across before. We're around 500 employees, mainly based in the Bath office. And some key projects that you might know us for, we've been supporting the recent business transformation of the Metropolitan Police Force and helping to bring in new technologies and digital transformation aspects in that. We've also, as you can see on the kind of picture on the right, we're a key player as part of the Aircraft Carrier Alliance, doing some of the initial concept work and then helping with the detailed design work of the 2 new UK aircraft carriers. And we also do a lot of in-service support work, so helping to maintain the UK Royal Navy's nuclear fleet of submarines as well. So a broad range of areas that we cover in defence and security. So I just wanted to, before we get started, want to give a bit of a foreword to understand why we're talking about this topic today and why we've done this research. So we've had a couple of research projects recently, both internal and external consultancy, looking at this area, and we really wanted to open it up for wider discussion. We wanted to make sure that the wider community was aware of some of the thoughts we were having and some of the research work we were doing. And especially in regard to COVID-19, it's really put this project into context. So COVID-19 is a terrible pandemic that's affected the world, loads of businesses and countries across the world. But what it has done, for better or for worse, it has started to really accelerate digital transformation. And this in part includes automation. We've witnessed the rise of robotic shop floor assistants. We've seen robotics used for university graduation ceremonies, where instead of attending something in person, you control a small robot that goes along dressed up in a gown and picks up the certificate for you. And we're starting to see these things kind of come into kind of life more and more as we want to have that physical distancing. And although the idea of robots taking over the world has been kind of long in science fiction films like Terminator or iRobot, and it might seem a bit surreal at first, but actually, if we don't consider the ethics and the social impacts properly, then however far-fetched, it could become a possibility in the future. So we've been looking at how we can really consider the ethics practical and social impact of greater autonomy, and how do we automate compassion and empathy, and answering some of those questions. So as we're really embracing this fourth digital industrial revolution, I think it's a role of not only just the government, but industry and academia all working together to understand the legal, safe and ethical use of autonomous systems, and including autonomous weapon systems, and to kind of set the right framework in place for us to work collaboratively on this. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Sarah Buffham, who will be giving our main presentation for today.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. I will apologise in advance if my dog starts barking. There's not much I can do about that. So over the last decade, we have witnessed a fundamental shift in the way that we wage war, as we increasingly use and proliferate development of unmanned systems such as the Predator, Reaper and Global Hawk drones. Such technology operates under human control for now, and there are instances of weapon systems that can operate autonomously, but the inevitable rapid and exponential development of artificial intelligence technologies may lead to the future military use of autonomous weapon systems. So tomorrow's machines will have the ability to execute missions without the involvement of a human operator, and will be increasingly used in human-machine teams. This comes an ethical and legal minefield, which academics, industry, non-governmental organisations, other international institutions have all weighed in. And yet, the only consensus that can be reached between these groups is that technology is currently outpacing the development of doctrine. So as a multifaceted topic, it's necessary to outline these issues in an accessible way. And this webinar seeks to clarify and outline the core themes in the ethical debate, including accountability, responsibility, and human out-of-the-loop decision-making. So using this information, we then can project the key role that defence and security industry will have in ensuring the ethical use of AI technology. At the start of this research, I traced the thought development of autonomy from Da Vinci's self-propelled cart and the Whitehead torpedo to unmanned systems, driverless cars, and at the very end of the pathway, artificial general intelligence, which is very far off fruition. And then using information from the Maritime Autonomous Service Ships, UK industry conduct, principles and code of practice, and also information collated from reports by the Defence Doctrine and Concept Centre, we form definitions of the level of control pathway from manned to autonomous. So at level 0, we have a system that is controlled on board by operators. Level 1 to 5 concern the level of cognitive functionality that the system has. So from level 1, where cognitive functionality is held with the human operator, who makes all the decisions, directs and controls all vehicle and mission functions, to level 4, where the operator may monitor the events and responses in which the system can sense environment and report its state, define actions, decides, acts and reports its action. So this can be a wake homing torpedo or other homing fire or forget devices. An autonomous system we define as something that is afforded a maximum degree of independence and self-determination within the context of capabilities and limitations. The system can understand higher level intent and perception of its environment. Such a system can take appropriate action to bring about a desired state, and it can decide a course of action from a number of alternatives without depending on human oversight and control, although these may be present. So why are these systems necessary? I think public opinion is and will always be a very important factor in the way that states employ warfare techniques. Naturally, the public tend to only support military campaigns that are proportional to the human costs suffered. Historically, this has been evident in public responses to American military campaigns such as Korea, Vietnam, which witnessed the success of asymmetrical warfare techniques deployed by insurgent groups, especially in Iraq, when the use of IEDs, which could fatally injure soldiers and cause significant damage to vehicles on the ground that were worth millions of dollars. In the UK specifically, when war repatriations became commonplace from the Falklands War onwards, a body bag syndrome developed as the human costs of war became visibly apparent to the public. So from this point, the technological quest has become finding ways to reduce the human toll, a risk transfer away from soldiers' lives on the line. And because of these factors, the development and operationalization of AI in autonomous weapon systems is largely considered to be a future of our international security environment. So where are we at currently in this debate? So Stop Killer Robots, which is a name that I don't agree with, but is fully referring to fully autonomous weapon systems. So they're saying that the conventional weapons has the power to prohibit weapons considered to be too excessive or discriminate. This slide illustrates a number of countries that have called for a preemptive ban on the use and development of fully autonomous weapon systems. Currently, there are 29 states that have officially declared support for treaty negotiation with the United Nations Convention on Conventional Weapons for an amendment that would make it legally binding in international law to ban autonomous weapon systems that are under no human control. So these countries are highlighted in pink. And I think you can see a general trend that the majority of these countries are less developed nations. I will point out, with the exception of China, which states that it's a call for a ban on the use of fully autonomous weapon systems, but not their development. However, some states have rejected the necessity for any such amendment. These are highlighted dark blue and notably include states such as France, Russia, Israel, the UK and the US. In defence of this stance, they focus on significant benefits autonomous weapon systems would have on mitigating risk to troops, increasing precision, and circumnavigating the political and ethical risk of human responses like shock and trauma in the battlefield. So the US is firmly advocating development and use of these weapons, and the UK pledges to not develop or use fully autonomous weapon systems, but does not seek a ban in international law. So that opens up an avenue for other types of autonomous weapon systems. So what is the current doctrine that's available? So the law of armed conflict requires that all operations should follow principles of humanity, proportionality, and military necessity. So this provides a justifiable context for war. So just war theory argues that war has to be morally justifiable through a series of criteria, all of which must be met for war to be considered just. So the criteria split into groups: the right to go to war, which is jus ad bellum, and right conduct in war, which is jus in bello. The war must have a just cause, so against evasion or self-defense, and not to acquire wealth or power. The war must be declared and controlled by a proper authority. The war must be fought to promote good or avoid evil, with the aim of restoring peace and justice after the war is over. In the later conditions, jus in bello argues that the war must be a last resort, should be fought with proportionality, and the good which is achieved by the war must be greater than the evil which led to the war. So this has in turn influenced the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1901, and Geneva Conventions of 1864, 1829 and 1949, which all outline humanitarian treatment in war. And this also has influenced weapons law, which states that weapons must be discriminate and do not cause unnecessary suffering or superfluous injury. In the UK context, this has influenced the Supreme Court to implement a proportionality. So this is a four-stage test to assess whether a measure that infringes a human right is proportionate based on just war theory. So how important is it to use this action? How rational is the basis for this action? How intrusive will this action be? And whether this the implementation of the action will be fair. Which then in turn links to ethical considerations that need to be made. For instance, should machines act as moral agents? Is it moral and ethical to subject persons to legal penalties or life or death decisions based on a machine judgment? So I recommend the ethical use of these systems requires consideration of some highly context-dependent factors. So, is it necessary? Is it proportional? Is there transparency of use? Does it uphold systems of accountability? And has collateral risk been considered? Using that criteria, I ask, can technology act ethically? So some scholars argue yes, explicitly stating that they can bring an ethical edge to the battlefield as they're unconstrained by the instinct of self-preservation. So this argument is soldiers can make mistakes in the heat of the battle, mistakes which are far less likely to be made if the pressure of a threat to life is removed from the context. So unaffected by psychological factors of shock, panic and fear, emotional responses can be bypassed, allowing for time to achieve accuracy, precision, and lower instances of collateral damages. On the other side, questions are raised over the impact of losing this human influence. So we can refer back to the point about rationality from the previous slide. Academics have argued that the ability to use insight, deliberate, and exercise rational judgment are uniquely human abilities. So therefore, AI and AWS will be limited by the fact that they lack actual intelligence. In turn, interest groups have argued that just war theory is determined subjectively by humans, which is incompatible with a machine. For instance, Human Rights Watch highlight the insurmountable difficulties in reliably distinguishing between lawful and unlawful targets as required by international humanitarian law. And the International Committee of the Red Cross also highlights the danger of full autonomy in context of extraterritorial lethal force on the informal battlefield. So I'll outline these difficulties using the Ooda Loop process. So if you have an interest in this area, you may have come across the term human in the loop and human out of the loop. So this loop is a reference to the Ooda Loop designed by military strategist John Boyd and shows a 4-step distillation of human decision making on the battlefield. So this goes as follows. So step 1, we observe the outside world and the results of our previous actions. Step 2, we take time to orient, analyse and synthesise everything we have learned in the observation phases. Step 3, the orientation guides our decisions and actions. And step 4, the result of those actions becomes more information that begins the next cycle of observation. Human out of the loop processes can reduce the effectiveness of decision making in this loop, as the system lacks organic thought processes and evaluation. Best to really describe this, observation includes an observation of the outside world. It requires intimate knowledge of the political, economic and social landscape, which is physical, mental and moral dimensions. The orient phase is elements of cultural nuance, socialization and history, which may be limited by the functions and design parameters of these systems. Decision phase includes implicit real-time decision making based on observation orientation. Can a program determine military necessity and make decisions based off that? And then the act phase, when you're carrying out the decision after an observation and orientation, which may or may not change the decision, which could have difficulties in upholding the proportionality principle in just war theory. This is because the 4 processes incur contextual analysis, judgment and empathy, of which these autonomous weapon systems may be incapable. So in Army of None, written by Paul Shah, he reflects, would a robot know when it's lawful to kill but wrong? He uses an anecdote from his military service in Afghanistan regarding a situation in which a young girl was spotting for Taliban fighters. So I'll just read a small section. The laws of war do not set an age for combatants. Behaviour determines whether or not a person is a combatant. If a person is participating in hostilities, as the young girl was by spotting for the enemy, then they are a lawful target for engagement. Killing a civilian who has stumbled across our position would have been a war crime, but it would have been legal to kill the girl. Context is everything. What would a machine have done in our place? If it had been programmed to kill lawful enemy combatants, it would have killed the little girl. So this anecdote highlights issues concerning the current use of drones and also future developments of increasingly autonomous systems, which cannot apply human judgment, empathy and morality to a situation. So with this system, think twice before killing a child. Should we replace humans with autonomous technology that does not understand the consequences of its actions and carries out functions without hesitation? Furthering this argument, there is a deontological ethical concern that autonomous weapon systems cannot use compassion and cannot choose to not commit a lawful action based on cognitive responses. So there is an argument that allowing technology to act in this way subverts a moral agency that defines, or has previously defined, our conventional wisdom of warfighting. Chris Coker, director of LSE Ideas and the writer of the publication The Future of War, which is included in our recommended reading, argues that historically, war has been rooted from the beginning in the bitter and unyielding experience of being human. This reflects a general criticism that autonomous weapon systems could dehumanise warfare. And there's a debate, is this a bad thing? Not necessarily, as we've heard before, with the removal of psychological factors that have potential to alter the course of battlefield engagement. However, there are ethical issues concerning moral agency to consider. So, is subjecting a human being to a life or death decision that is impersonal and based on predetermined programming rather than human judgment ethical? Of course, engineers, software developers and programmers have the skills to design a technology that can take several factors into account, analyse a large sum of data and make informed decisions based off that. However, the individual human ability to exercise situational judgment, which is based on interpersonal relationships, and empathetic responses which inform relevant judgments, is a determinant of moral agency. So what does agency mean? An agent is defined as a person who acts on behalf of another person or group. This is a concept grounded in the principle of moral responsibility and accountability, which will be incredibly difficult to issue in the context of autonomous weapon systems. Who is held responsible? There is a problem with many hands in this case, or no hands at all for that matter. So who is at fault? The programmer? The commander? The system itself? How would you ensure processes of accountability? These are all factors that need to be considered. So if executed properly, autonomous weapon systems can apply respect for persons, reduce the harms caused by war, mainly due to precision, limiting collateral damage and making it safer for the boots on the ground. However, if it's not, it exposes the danger of lowering the threshold for war, inciting heavier militaristic engagement with limited responsibility and accountability when peaceful alternatives may have been possible. So why is this discussion necessary? We can look to the future. So in this research, we developed a horizon scan that outlines 4 possible, but not exclusive futures concerning autonomous technology. This analysis has been informed by technology roadmaps, non-governmental organisation and UN reports, and also some academic sources. The key factors identified are the level at which the technology is embraced by the key states in the international security environment, and the extent to which development of and use is regulated. These 4 scenarios are exhibited at extreme level, and it's understood that the future reality could sit somewhere within this matrix with a combination of these futures. So what will happen if this technology is not embraced? Scenario 1. Ban on the use and development internationally binding under a treaty amendment to the United Nations Convention on Chemical Weapons. So this has heavy regulations and sanctions for violations, and shows that the pink countries that were highlighted in the international debate slide is brought globally. But again, we will not see the benefits that these systems could bring. In scenario 3, where there is no regulation or acceptance, development could occur through breakaway groups who may use it to promote criminal or terrorist activity. States may have an unregulated arms race to develop in response. So if this technology is embraced by the international security environment but has no regulation, we may see something that resembles scenario 4, where there is no regulation, but the technology is embraced in ways that can violate international humanitarian law, directly cause arbitrary killing of civilians with no restrictions on development or any processes of accountability for improper use. So the most ideal of these scenarios is scenario 2. The technology is embraced and under regulation which sets out predetermined design parameters. The technology can be used to enhance just war theory, minimise civilian casualties, enhance soldier performance on the battlefield, whilst also operating under an umbrella of human accountability. So who is responsible for ensuring that this is the case? While no one party can be wholly responsible, to ensure a considered and well-rounded approach, input must be required from academia, industry and government. This can operate as a golden triangle, which is beneficial because each group has different perspectives and an ability to influence different elements. So on the academic side, we can engage in informed philosophical debates surrounding the ethical and legal implications. The industry has a role in leading development, setting design parameters and creating assurance mechanisms for ethical use. And the government has a role in exercising oversight and implementing a proactive system of checks and balances. To achieve this golden triangle with academia, industry and government working together, the creation of the right forums and mechanisms are necessary to allow the open exchange of ideas and views, a combined community of interest. So Paul Shah, as I've spoken about before, I'm a Senior Fellow and Director of the Technology and National Security Programme at the Centre for New American Society, who was the award-winning author of Army of None and has established policies on unmanned, unautonomous systems in emerging weapons technologies, argues, and I second, that the winner of the robotics revolution will not be who develops this technology first, but who figures out how to best use it. In an effort to do this, some recommendations can be made. The first is to increase awareness. Talk to your colleagues, read literature to understand the background and requirement of these systems. Just be an active player in the conversation. After this, we can inform ethics boards and communities of interest across the Golden Triangle that are directly responsible for tracking the evolving arguments and engaging with non-governmental organisations and pressure groups. Using these arguments, we can then ethically guide development. Of guidelines that can be employed across the development pathway. For instance, the US Department of Defence have recently released guidelines which can be a good place to start, but need to be evaluated to see if they can fit in the UK context and intention for these weapon systems. And finally, and as we've seen in the future scenario slide, development and use of this technology can be technology driven or regulation driven. While there's no right answer, and guided from the previous 3 recommendations, a system of predetermined regulation and design parameters could be issued that can preemptively halt any development of these systems with malicious intent. And you can get started on the first recommendation today. For more information and more in-depth study of these issues, we will send you the report, and any extra information, references and sources will be included from which this webinar is based. I will now pass on to Jake for a roundup and any questions that you may have.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah, for a brilliant presentation. I'd just like to summarise by reiterating some of these key points that you went through. So first of all, looking at those recommendations at the end and making sure that the importance of increasing the kind of knowledge and understanding, and creating those communities of interest between industry, academia, and government. And that's something that we feel particularly strongly about and want to kind of start that discussion through conversations today, and start forming those kind of those groups. And another thing I will say is that it's a particularly difficult topic to navigate, and through our conversations, we're not necessarily saying that any one of these situations is completely right. Any one of those scenarios is the right way to go, and it really does need to be properly thought through and considered from loads of different aspects and angles to make sure that the decision and kind of outcome is clear and from a well-rounded point of view. As Sarah was saying before, if you go on to the next slide, Sarah, we will be sending out a white paper that we've been producing on this topic. So we'll send this out via email after the presentation this afternoon. And inside it, it's got a bit more information around what we've spoken about today. It's got extra information, resources, references, and hopefully we can keep adding to it. So thank you again, everyone, for dialing in and for listening to this session. I think it's probably now time to go to the question and answers board to see if we've had any questions come in or any thoughts, any points we'd like to discuss. So I'll just turn my webcam on as well, and we'll get some of the questions going. So there's one here from Alan Cartwright. The whole question of an international ban on control at national binding level introduces a key problem. No matter what level of ban controls are agreed upon by national states, the relative ease and access to the technologies could give tremendous advantage to those insurgent forces and other powers that do bring them in. Yeah, completely agree with what you're saying. And it's one of these points where even if we were to choose not to develop these kinds of systems and kinds of weapons, we need to be aware of their capabilities and how we could counter them, because yeah, as you're saying, through this kind of technology becoming increasingly available, could easily be picked up by some of our competitors and some of our foes, which would yeah, have a huge impact on asymmetric warfare. I don't know, Sarah, if you had any other thoughts on this. I think it's a general agreement on that point.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Jake. I think it's important that if the technology is embraced in terms of the key international security environment, that there will be roles in which to prevent insurgent forces being able to develop and use these systems, which is when if there's just a complete blanket ban but no enforcement of it, we have a serious danger of allowing development to occur through breakaway groups, which can use them in not very nice ways.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've got another question here from Monty. It's a hard question, but a good question. So you're saying we've talked a lot about the kind of ethics and principles of autonomous weapons. He's asking about the ethics about life-saving AI for things like search and rescue algorithms, and noting the iRobot scenario as well. So if you haven't seen the film iRobot, the scenario is the main protagonist, played by Will Smith, is very against robotic systems because he is in a car crash and the robot chose to save him over a small child, a little girl, because he had a greater chance of survival. So this is a really challenging topic as well, and I think it really highlights that it's the whole question around the ethics of autonomy is really difficult and multifaceted. It's not just one view, it's not just one viewpoint. I think, from my opinion, it had to take a similar approach in terms of life saving, because you're still making that life and death decision. And you still need to be able to weigh up those other considerations, like as discussed in the film, that it's not always just about the highest probability of success on who's more likely to survive. Actually, there are other factors to play in that, which is really important to consider. So if you had anything else to add, Sarah, on that?
No, I think so. I think you basically covered it. I think there is, I guess, in terms of the argument, what would a human do in that context and what would a machine do in that context, and if those two contexts would be different and have a different result, and working out the best way to deal with that in an ethical way.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I've got one from Rolly Rogers and said, mentioned the golden triangle of academia, industry and government, but where does the warfighter or NGOs fit into this construct? So I think that's a good point. From that, we're definitely not excluding them. They're a key part of the conversation. I was thinking that would probably more come under the government angle in terms of kind of the warfighter normally, but that's got to be a key part of it because they're going to be at the coalface, they're going to be dealing with it, and ultimately have the experience of these scenarios and what they would do in these different scenarios. So that's definitely got to feed into it. So we need to have this really well-rounded community. Also got another one from Alex Dupre, saying about any ethical consideration around non-lethal weapon systems such as remote and autonomous sensors for mine hunting. So I think, again, we'll say similar rules apply, but it's a bit more of a controlled environment if you're doing things like mine hunting, because you haven't got, you're not dealing with a kind of a human interface in the same way that you might be in other scenarios. But still the kind of same rules apply. Are you still keeping the human in the loop? And if you're taking that human user out of the loop, are you making sure that the right considerations are in place and the right methodologies in place to make sure that suitable techniques are considered? Sarah, I don't know if you had any other points to add from your research.
Yeah, I think the best person to answer that question might be John, but yeah. I also think that in terms of the non-lethal weapon systems, there are other considerations that do need to be made. Environmental concerns, what will happen, you know, is there is what it's doing, is it necessary, is it proportional, what is the risk of collateral damage, is there assurance mechanisms to make sure that if something was to go wrong, that something would not, the level of damage that it would cause would be limited. So I think those would be the considerations that I would make in that context.
Yeah, agree. And yeah, apologies as well that John can't be here today. But I think that's a good question that I'd look to pose to John as well. So we'll follow up afterwards with some feedback from John on that. I've got a question from Sam Bagshaw about wondering if we had any thoughts on ethical theory and whether we should be thinking in terms of consequentialism or other ethical considerations. Sarah, I don't know if you could answer this one.
So the consequentialist argument is the results of these actions and the consequences of the actions that are made. So that's using the just war theory as something proportional, distinction, the difference between lawful and lawful combatants, the level of risk that is going to be made. And then on the flip side of that is the deontological argument, which is just focused on the concept of right or wrong itself. So if we go back to the anecdote that Shah talks about when he's saying, would a machine have killed the little girl? That is an argument that is consequentialist because of the consequences that has happened, but also deontological, because there is a concept of right or wrong itself there. You'd consider, you wouldn't kill a little girl. So I think using those arguments, it's difficult to decide which one's more important, and I think it's important to consider both. And in terms of ethical theory, it's quite hard to explain something that, because I've dedicated quite a lot of time during my master's to understanding the ethical theory behind this. My dissertation talked about the importance of human agency in warfare, so ensuring that is there a human that's acting on behalf of a human, or is there a machine that's acting on behalf of someone, and is that an ethical thing to do, and is that an ethical way to treat other humans? Is that a respect for persons? So I think that's how that's my thoughts anyway.
That's a good point. I should pick up another point. So it's from Anonymous, but it's a really good point. That's why I've published this to the front, and said the really important issues, but are actively discussed in military doctrine requirements and current regulatory forms. So I agree that it's great and they are being discussed, but I think we just wanted to kind of bring to light some of the the wider arguments, and to show that a wider community can really bring extra insight and extra support to these forums. So not necessarily looking to replace any forums at all, just wanted to kind of make sure that it was in people's minds, but that we are discussing it, we are thinking about it, and to see where wider industry and academia can get involved in these discussions and forums as well. So that's a really good point. I'm definitely not trying to kind of replicate those other forums that are already being discussing this.
Yeah, I would reinforce that, Jake, by just saying that one of the recommendations that we make is to increase awareness, and this webinar is a way in which we're seeking about doing this and showing that we are thinking about these considerations, and how we can be responsible in making a difference.
Yeah, sounds great. Just got another question in from Alan Bain, saying, surely human control is not in the drive sense level on board, but is in the system's hierarchy commanding the missions and giving the orders. Sarah, if you could help to answer that one. Well, in terms of the meaningful human control and human control, there is a difference. So for meaningful human control, there is a influence in terms of the real-time decision making that the machine is making, and ways in which that can be overridden, and also processes of accountability that come with that. Whereas human control is something that is much less explicit, because, well, you can't argue that there hasn't been any human influence in the creation of the system or the use of the system, because there always will be, but it just depends on whether that control is meaningful or not. Yeah, that's great. We've got a few other kind of comments rather than necessarily questions just coming in, so I just thought I'd discuss some of these. So one's saying that weapons are used for destruction. Sorry, just reading through, it's a long comment. Yeah, so it's making a comment. I've published it to the wider Q&A board, something to read through, but I think it's the kind of in line with what Sarah was talking about before, for the reasons of going to war, and the kind of overall goal of what we should be trying to achieve with these aims and with the kind of wider warfare. So yeah, it's a really nice comment. Another one from Ollie Bowen saying, yeah, comment looking at the legal responsibility aspects that will develop out of other sectors, including autonomous vehicles. So I think that, yeah, this is a really good point, that it's not just the kind of in the military area, because there's other autonomous systems and other things going on. Not only will they have an impact on the legal structure that we're working to, but they'll also have a big impact on the kind of social exceptions or of these technologies. So if autonomous vehicles become widespread and everyone just accepts that it's okay to drive around in driverless vehicles, then that will help to kind of support the wider kind of social support for these autonomous weapon systems and autonomous weapon systems in warfare as well. But on the counter side, if we see a massive backlash against these, so if there's loads of kind of high publicity crashes of cars from Tesla, there have been examples of, and then that has a kind of wider impact on the social opinion on autonomous weapons, and that can have a real negative impact on using it for other applications as well. So we can't just be looking at one aspect. We need to be taking in, well, what are other people doing? What's that doing to wider opinion, and what effect is having on the wider kind of legal arguments as well. So that's a really good point. So thanks, Ollie.
I think I would also say that in terms of the legal responsibility, we're talking about autonomous vehicles. You always need to be even more restrictive on these, because this is something that will operate in everyday life in our own countries and be a massive risk to people in terms of crashing. And if something does crash and someone is fatally injured, then who is held responsible for that? Is it the person who bought the car? Is it the person who designed the car? Is it the person who built the car? All of those factors are something that we can then look at, and the way that the industry is approaching those issues, we can then take and use in the context of autonomous weapon systems.
Great. I've got a few other comments. So Gordon Meadow has shared a link from some of the Royal Academy of Engineering safety and ethics work that they've been looking at. So there's a link, and we can share this work as part of that as well. So we'll be in touch afterwards. That's a great idea. Also got another question from Rolly Rogers about what about the wider battle space in outer space and deep ocean. I know you corrected that to be kind of below further greater depth than 100 meters, so more like 1,000 meters, where there's no human presence, and the type of conflict will be robot on robot, and how this type of scenario will change our kind of thinking around that. So I'm going to field this one to Sarah, if that's all right.
Yeah, I also, in terms of the deep ocean, that is definitely a question that John can answer, because he has a lot of experience in this area. From I try and use my perspective on it. There still has to be ethical and regulatory framework against this, and that's not because the risk to the human is less, but because we still need to decide whether something is a just cause. That theory still applies. Is it necessary? Will it be proportional? The amount of money that goes into the creation of these systems and the damages that could happen, is that proportional to the good that it could create? And also, in part of that, where there are in deep ocean or battle space, outer space and inner space, what are the environmental concerns of that as well, because that will massively impact how we use this technology, and in terms of recovery if something goes wrong.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that's something that we'll go back to John, and he'll definitely be able to provide a bit more detail on that. So I don't want to kind of miss anything there. So conscious of time, I think there's kind of one other comment I really wanted to raise, and that's something from Alan Cartwright, and I've shared it and published it on the Q&A board. And he said, at a tactical and operational level, irrespective of the level of autonomy available, the battlefield commander will very much require to keep control of the battle development. So level 5 full AI decision making is surely likely to remain necessarily subject to human monitoring and override even amidst the fog of war. And yeah, it's all still in the commander's control. So I definitely agree with that one. I think that's a really good point to surround all of these conversations that we're having. So even though we're looking at and we're talking about these use of autonomous weapons, it's still very much in control of the commander. There's still, even if it's kind of to send out, the human commander will be in control of that aspect. So yeah, always consider that. That's a really nice point to, I think, to finish off our discussions and to round this off.
Yeah, I think I also want to say about that, in exactly what Alan is saying, is what we agree with. We want to make sure that this is something that happens, and to ensure that this relationship between battlefield commander and the autonomous system is maintained, and that there is a meaningful human element to it, in terms of there might be a human out of the loop processing, but there is always a meaningful human control. Yes, amidst the fog of war, the autonomous system can be incredibly beneficial in seeking clarity. They don't have the psychological factors of shock and fear, but also there is a intermittable human ability to take a situation and shape it to do something different and change the course of a battlefield, which an autonomous system may not be able to achieve on its own based on predetermined programming.
Great. Yeah, well said, Sarah. Better than I could articulate. So thank you. So I think that's kind of all I had left to say. So I just want to say thank you very much, everyone, for attending and for discussing these topics with us. Apologies if I haven't got around to your question that you posted in the Q&A thing. If I haven't done that, then I'll make sure that we'll come back to you separately and answer those questions. And perhaps we'll get John to feedback on some of those other questions that he has that better knowledge of and would provide a better answer for. So yeah, that's it from me. Just thank you very much for attending, and hope to keep the conversation going and be in touch. Thank you.